left. Hi. So my name is Adriel Wallick, and I'm an independent game developer. I'm best known for being the organizer of a game jam that occurs on a train once a year, as well as having made one new game every week for an entire year once. And in this talk, I'm going to go into Game a Week, what that project was, why I did it, what I learned from it, and kind of more importantly, what I didn't learn from it. But before I delve into all of that, brief history of who I am and how I got here. I went to university, and when I was done with that, and I graduated with my degree in engineering, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, so I spent a couple years working in like a big old company and writing code for something that would go into space eventually. And after a while, I decided that's not what I wanted to do, and what I wanted to do was make games. So I started teaching myself game development on the side, attending local game developer meetups, and networking with people from the industry. And after a few years of that, I finally got hired as a programmer at a small indie studio in Boston in the States. And while I was there, I was contracted out with Harmonix, worked on their next Rock Band game, which was Rock Band Blitz, which is a Rock Band game nobody's ever heard of. And once that project was over, I moved over to a small contract studio where I worked with bigger companies like Hasbro and the Boston Museum of Science to make sort of games for that. And at that point, after bouncing around and doing all of that, I realized that what I wanted to actually do was go full indie, make my own games, and do all that. Which, after quitting my job, I was super excited to start working on all those games that I had, floating around in my head for many, many years. And I knew solo game development wasn't going to be super easy, but I figured, I'd be able to take one of those great ideas, get a prototype out in a couple weeks, spend a few months refining it, have a great game within a year. It turns out that I had never actually made a game by myself, and doing all the non-programming tasks was not super easy, so I spent a few months procrastinating on all of that. I invented Train Jam, started that running, traveling around, and generally just sort of avoiding making games. And eventually I sort of had to face the fact that I was a good programmer, and I'd worked on lots of projects, but I had no idea how to actually make a game. So a friend eventually suggested to me to just make something in a week, and then throw it out. Didn't matter what it was, didn't matter if it was good, didn't matter if it was bad, just make something so that I could make something and start gaining experience making things, and eventually that would lead to making a good thing. So that's sort of where Game a Week came from. And what I did when I started doing Game a Week was I solidified just a couple rules that I followed every single week. And these are the main sort of constraints that I followed. Easy, release a game every week. For me, that was Sundays. I just sort of chose it arbitrarily. I had to release the game every single week to the public. I just sort of published it on my own website, and that was super easy. Don't repeat ideas. One of the points of this was to just sort of vary my mechanics and my ideas as much as possible to get as much of a spread of ideas. And then always write a postmortem every single week, explore what went right, what went wrong, and all the lessons that I learned from doing that game that week. So I did those 4 things every single week for an entire year, and by the end of it, I learned a lot of lessons, which you're all going to hear about now. A lot of the lessons that I learned from doing Game a Week came about as a natural progression of just repeating that same base task over and over again. There's a story that gets told about a pottery teacher who splits her class into 2. She tells half the class that they have the entire semester to plan and design the best clay pot. They can spend as much time as they wanted and needed to plan that pot, but at the end of the semester, they had to submit that one clay pot that they had designed. The other half of the class got to design as many clay pots as they wanted, and their grade was based on the quantity, so that they could sort of refine and refine and refine. And at the end, they also got to submit their best clay pot, and the teacher would choose the best pot. And long story short, all the best pots came from the second half of the class where they did it over and over again. And this story was sort of the basis of Game a Week. It's a good story to illustrate that the only really true way to learn how to do something is to just do it, and do it over and over again. And so a lot of the things that I'm going to go over might sort of seem super straightforward in hindsight, but they're things that got solidified for me over the weeks of repeating that same task of make a game. And I've given talks on the lessons I've learned from Game a Week, and I learned a lot of lessons, but in the years since I finished Game a Week, because I finished this back in 2015, I started spending a lot of time sort of thinking about whether Game a Week was good, or was it bad? Did I burn myself out? Yes. Did I perpetuate a bunch of crunch culture? Yes. Did I do anything with any of those 52 games I made? No. Is that bad? I don't know. So I just want to go through a lot of the lessons that I learned, and I want to go through those major lessons and, again, talk about the things I didn't learn, because everything sort of had a flip side. Obviously, the most important lesson I learned was how to rapidly prototype. I'm at a point now where if I have a basic idea for a game, I can just sort of bust out a working version in just a few hours. And this is really great for when you're working on a new game. And it's something that people sort of know me for, and one of my main selling points when I'm pitching for contract work. I've gone through the act of starting a new project from scratch and getting a concept up and working without much thought a bazillion times. And because of that, a lot of the projects that I work on get off to a really great and fast start. However, something that I've heard many people say over the years is that games are never really finished. You're just sort of done developing your game eventually. You just sort of stop. And it's true, it's borderline impossible to make the exact game that you set out to make with all the features that you wanted, with the budget you expected, and at the release date that you were planning on. And because of that, there's very small difference between a finished game and an unfinished game. It's just sort of this fuzzy line. And every single one of my Game of Week games sort of hit all those major check boxes of what I would define as a finished game. I released them to the public, people could pay me for them, I did a postmortem, all those sort of little check boxes. But I'm not sure that I would ever say any of the Game of Week games were finished games. Ultimately, they're just unpolished prototypes that I put on my website that people could throw money at. So even though I can start a game super fast, I've never really learned how to finish a game. When I think about how many games I've released in my career, the answer is 3. And 2 of them are just very, very small, insignificant games. There was that Rock Band game I was telling you about. And 2 very small games, a puzzle game called Candescent and a really small personal game called Press X to Be Okay. And that's sort of it, even though I spent a whole year just making games over and over and over again. And that's fine. We all know it's harder to finish a game than to start it, but I think the bad thing that happened here was that I was so swept up in Game of Week and jamming that I never realized that I never learned how to make a game and take a project through polish, how to add a credit screen or an options menu or all those things that we don't think about. And that final 90% of game development was just sort of completely out of my scope of learning, and it's impacted me a lot because my attention span for a project is now super short. I have a hard time pushing any game further than a prototype on my own because that's just not what I'm used to. And the point of Game of Week was for me to actually learn how to make games on my own, and in retrospect, it's something that Game of Week never could have taught me in the way that I structured it. And then scope is that second major lesson that I learned from doing something like Game of Week. I very quickly learned that every single game idea is too big. Doesn't matter whose idea it is, how large or small of a team is creating the game, or how much you think you've pared down your idea. It's still too big forever and always. And so every single week, I would make sure to pare my ideas down to the tiniest sliver of a mechanic. If I had 2 mechanics, one would get thrown out. If my idea even felt slightly too big, I would just remove as much as I could. And at the time, that felt great. And I know that it's a super important skill for game development. But again, I experienced that other side of the lesson by spending all this time just sort of focusing on producing games that contained exactly one small mechanic. I never really refined my ability to put multiple mechanics together, and it's rare that one mechanic can make an entirely commercially released game. There's lots of games based on one simple mechanic, but the difference is that it gets sort of explored and expanded, and you just sort of get to see different explorations of that mechanic, and it's not really what I was doing at all. I was making one mechanic work and abandoning it forever. Every single week, which means that I was just sort of focusing on gimmicks instead of real games. And because the time constraint of Game of Week and the knowledge that I would just be throwing it out there and never looking at it again, I never really once explored the idea of, multiple interacting mechanics. My little games weren't games, they were just sort of proof of concepts for a mechanic within the framing of a game. And I never really once thought about the fact that I could take all of my weeks and sort of string them together. I could take a mechanic from the week before, put it in the mechanic that I wanted to do this week, and just sort of explore that. And ultimately, that was sort of a really big, huge detriment for the way I approached making games for a long time after Game of Week, and it was something I actively had to unlearn over the next few years, which I think I finally broke that habit. And going on from that, as I said earlier, every week I did a postmortem. Where the idea came from, what went right, what went wrong, and what I learned. It sort of helped me organize my thoughts and see where my weak spots were, which there were many. And there were some weeks where I couldn't think of anything that went right, and some weeks I couldn't think of anything that went wrong. And on those weeks, I tended to reach out to fellow game developers and friends to see, what I did actually learn, what I wasn't seeing, because you can't make a game for a whole week and not learn anything. That's impossible. And as I was prepping this talk, I actually went back and read every postmortem that I wrote throughout Game of Week. And out of all the lessons I learned, the lesson I learned the most was start my game earlier every week. I wrote those words in one form or another in 19 of my 52 postmortems, which is roughly 37% of the weeks. And it's not like I learned it a lot in the beginning and learned my lesson and learned it less later. I just consistently through the whole year just kept learning that lesson. And I think that sort of illustrates one of the downfalls of how I approached Postmortems. For most part, I would look at my game, analyze how it went, go through all the motions of picking through my week, write it all up, put it out there. But it wasn't until I read through all the Postmortems a couple weeks ago that I even looked at them ever again. I never applied the lessons I was learning. I thought I was because I wrote them up, and that sounds like you're learning something. But I just didn't. How many of you out there have written a postmortem for a game? How many of you have read that postmortem ever again? 2 of you, good job. And I mean 6 months later, not just immediately later, like a significant amount of time later. Anybody? No, okay. And yeah, that was one of those things. For me, a lot of my lack of actually applying the insights came from the fast-paced nature of Game of Week. There was barely any breathing room week to week, and it wasn't until after Game of Week ended that I was really able to catch my breath and take a break. But by then, I was so burnt out on the concept of Game of Week that I didn't even want to look at it again. I didn't want to think about games, and I didn't want to look at any of the prototypes or read any of the postmortems, and I just sort of never did it again. I think that's something that's super common in a lot of projects in game development, not just things like Game of Week and short jams, but large projects come with that era of just wanting to be done with it. That's what they say, the last 10% is 90% of the work, which if you think about the first part of what I said, where 90% of game development was out of the scope of Game of Week taught me basically nothing. That's just how math works. So yeah, the lesson here is make time after your projects are over to absorb the lessons that you actually did learn. Go read your old postmortems. It'll probably be more helpful than you're thinking. And when I was, the most practical lesson that I learned, obviously, from something like Game of Week was deadlines. For 52 weeks, I hit a deadline of releasing something every week, which when you think about it is kind of cool. To be fair, there were 6 weeks where I didn't release a game, but still, I went through the postmortem of weeks that I didn't even make a game, and I sort of wanted to go through what went right and what went wrong, so I still released something. And though hitting a schedule is obviously incredibly important, the rigidity of how I structured Game of Week in my mind led me to never considering the fact that I could just extend a deadline. I just sort of worked myself to the bone to do the deadline every week. And it's one of those game production skills that Game of Week unfortunately kept me from learning. The fact that sometimes projects just need to be delayed to be the best that they can be. I pushed myself hard week to week and mentally beat myself up every time I had to skip a week. And, I was being my own worst producer, and it's something I think everybody should just be aware of, is deadlines are cool and all, and we should all hit them, but sometimes they just have to go away. You just need to breathe. I'm running out of time. So to wrap this up in a bit, I want to talk about what I think were the 2 biggest things that I took away personally from spending an entire year making one new game every week. The first being that it really helped me transition into being comfortable being a creative. Until I started Game of Week, I was a tech person. I was an engineer and a programmer. I worked in an office all day. And I was always sort of the tech person. That's how I grew up. I always loved tech, whatever. But I knew that I had this more creative side to myself that I just wasn't sure how to get to. And that's sort of the #1 reason why I left the space systems industry and came to games, is there's not really any creative freedom when you're working on a $12 billion thing you're going to strap to a rocket and shoot into space. Rightfully so. It was cool, but that's not what I wanted. I didn't want to spend weeks on end making sure that my code adhered to NASA standards. I wanted to make things that allowed me to show off this weird little creative monster that was rolling around in my head. But once I transitioned to game, I still needed to get out of that tech shell that I was in. I had to put myself out there to really figure out how to make games instead of just being a games programmer, which is a subtle sounding difference, but it was big to me. And being able to figure out if making games was something I could do or anything I actually even wanted to do. So that was a cool exploration there. And the second one of these 2 big things that I learned was simple and much more generally applicable, is that burnout sucks. I spent an entire year jamming. Really let that sink in. How tired are you after a weekend of jamming? How tired are you after crunching? Extend that jam to a week and extend that crunch to a year. It was awful. I was constantly working. I was constantly switching my brain to a new project. I was constantly coming up with ideas, and I was constantly sort of just making and releasing a game. I was always working really late into night on the weekends, just sort of making things over and over again, and I did that for a whole freaking year. And at the end of that, I was super burnt out. I didn't work on anything else for months because I couldn't bring myself to turn my brain back on after actually giving it a real break. And I went to this hole of being completely lost creatively, and it took me a really long time to pull out of it. It was probably another year until I worked on something of my own again. And I've gotten a lot better since Game of Week about taking breaks and started actually tracking my time on projects and scheduling, like 1 day a week where I'm not working. But it's something that I thought just had to happen in order to become a creative person. Everyone crunches, everyone works too hard, all those good myths. And it's one of the reasons why I become super wary of ever suggesting something like Game of Week to anyone anymore, or even a jam, because jams have gotten so prevalent in the games industry and culture is so insidious. Do I really want to be adding to that? Do I really want to say that spending an entire year jamming and burning yourself is great? And I don't think I have an answer to that. Best I can do is just sort of say what I experienced and let people figure out their own stuff. Which is weird. I organize one of the biggest jams in the world, and I'm like, I don't know, man. And yeah, that's sort of my big, long, fast, rambling thing here. And to sort of summarize what I've been trying to say through this whole talk, is that a thing that teaches you something doesn't necessarily teach you something else, is sort of the big takeaway here. Almost every lesson I talked about had a corresponding thing I didn't learn and was detrimental. For the rapid prototyping is that I never learned how to do game production. For scope, it was that I never learned how to make things work together. For critically analyzing my own process, it was just that I didn't have any structure to internalize those lessons. And I think these specific things are all super important to think about, but to extrapolate it even further, what I'm trying to say is that I feel it's really important to make sure that you're looking into the spaces of what you're doing. And that's sort of the whole summary of this talk. Figure out what it is that you're passively missing, what you're not learning, and what you're not improving on, just by the very nature of the sort of learning, not learning duality that I just made up. And make sure you're approaching your process with a critical eye and taking the time and care to take a step back. Okay, that was it.
Wow.
I had a lot of words. I have 17 seconds to spare.
Because I think we had already said that we were trying to compress the talk in such a small time anyway. And I was going to let you run over. And you just... So let's get some questions, because I know Vera's here, but she's running a little bit behind. So a question at the front here.
Hi, thanks for the talk.
Yeah, sorry it was so fast.
So if I understood correctly, you made 52 prototypes, out of which 46 were released.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So wasn't there any of those prototypes such that you would have wanted to pursue further and actually make into a polished product?
There were a few, and there's one that I actually just picked up a couple weeks ago to be like, yeah, I should release this on iOS just real quickly. I think the big problem was, like I said, once I was done with Game of Week, I was so burnt out that I didn't want to look at anything that had to do with Game of Week ever again. And so I sort of just put it into this folder, and I didn't look at it for a long time. And then you know how it is when you lose momentum on a project, and you're just like, oh, well, I'll never do that again. And then also, since I had focused a whole year on that, my savings had run out, so then I had to pick up contract work and blah, 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 and it sort of spiraled out of there. But there are ones that I would like to do something with. I just haven't. But I learned lessons.
Will you probably, at some point, go back to one of those?
Yeah, I'd like to. I always joke that I think it would have been really cool, and I might still do this someday, is pick 4 of my favorite ones and do polish and production a quarter, which has way less of a catchy title, but would still be really cool to just spend 3 months on 4 different ones of them and try and get them going. It's something that's been in my mind, and one of these days I might do it, but I have no solid plans right now.
It feels like, the kind of my career of basically having to run services for 20 years.
Yeah.
Sounds like the absolute antithesis of what you've done. And I mean, literally, it's like how do you make this thing that's already been done work?
Yeah.
And it's a nightmare, but it's complete. And again, all the opposite lessons that you've described about crunch, it's making sure you don't do crunch because you can't.
Yeah.
Because you've got to still be doing this.
So with our powers combined.
Yeah, we will take over the universe. Well, I do actually. I mean, I'm kind of joking, but I think there is something about what would that formula be, or how would you teach yourself or other people how to do that sustained delivery that deals with an audience. I don't think there's a way to do it, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know.
One last question.
Ever-present questions.
Because I'd just carry on talking otherwise. There's one back there.
Hi, thanks for the interesting talk. So I just had one question. Are you now more creative after the Game Week thing?
Am I more what?
Creative.
I think so. I mean, it definitely gave me a crash course on what other things are involved in games other than just programming. All those things that I knew existed, I just had never tried them before. I think I have a lot better feel for where my strengths and weaknesses lie in terms of creativity. So I don't know if that makes me more creative per se, or just more knowledgeable about what's inside of me in that sort of like fluffy kind of way. I feel it was a net positive in terms of my game development processes, I guess is my answer to that.
And sadly, I know there's a few more people who want to ask questions, but we'll have to call it time. Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thank you.